Good morning and welcome to Bible class. We're going to Jericho today in our virtual Bible class because there is a big story that we don't talk about a lot, and I want to share it with you today. So I'm glad you're here, and let's get started. So we're not going to sing the continent song, but you can say it out loud as we fly over the continents. We're starting on North America, flying over the Atlantic Ocean across the continent of Africa. We're going to zoom in to a very small part of the continent of Asia and the country of Israel. Hey, look, guys, there's the Dead Sea. We studied that a couple weeks ago. Now we're going to go to the north end of the Dead Sea to a town called Jericho. And here's a different map of Jericho. And I want you to notice it's north of the Dead Sea, and it's still in that Jordan River Valley, which is, remember, the Dead Sea is the lowest point on land on earth. And that also means that Jericho is the lowest city on earth. Excuse me. And so it is not too far away from Jerusalem, and it's about 7 miles. And the yellow star is a very important location today because that is where the Israelites camped out on their way to the promised land. And so we're going to talk about when the Israelites left Egypt and they came north and were ready to conquer Jericho. But we're not going to talk about the battle. You can read that with your family in Joshua chapter 2 and in the few chapters after that. But today we're going to start in Jericho and learn a little bit more about this very old town. Now, what you're seeing here is this tower. It doesn't look much like a tower anymore, but you can see what is left of it. It's actually one of the oldest man-made structures on Earth. Archaeologists, scientists who study old things, have discovered that it dates back to around 9000 BC. Does everybody remember what BC means? Everybody say it together. BC means?
Before Christ.
Got it. And so this tower would have already been here by the time Abraham came through, and it would have been here for 7,000 years already. Whoa, that is so old, because Abraham is 4,000 years ago. Holy cow. So this is very, very old. The oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. And so this is where our story begins. Now, one of the things that made Jericho such a long-lasting city was that they had water. They had a natural spring of water. Today it's called Elisha's spring, after the prophet Elisha. There's a really cool story in the book of 2 Kings where Elisha comes and heals their water. So go read that later. Pretty cool. So they have a lot of natural water there, and it's inside the city. And so even if they were to get in a battle, they'd still have fresh water to sustain them. And something else about Jericho is it has beautiful weather. Lots of sunshine, all this water, palm trees. Lovely, very lovely area. And something else that helped it stay a city for so long is something called the King's Highway. Now, this is another view of Jericho, and outside of the picture is a very special road called the King's Highway. Now, we've all driven on the highway in our towns, but of course, people in Jericho and around Jericho, they probably would have used camels and had a camel caravan, and they would have been traders. And so there would have been a lot of people traveling past Jericho and stopping into Jericho, kind of like a rest stop, right? So they would need to get some food and something to drink and maybe stay the night, and then they continue on their journey. That's important for the next part of our story. So I want to talk about this big hill. This big mound is actually called a tell, a T-E-L. And that just means it's a big mound, and underneath it are layers and layers and layers and layers of past cities. And so this part of Jericho, this Tel Jericho, is the oldest part of the city. So Jericho is like a 3-in-1. So it has ancient Jericho in this tell that you see here. And then there's the New Testament city of Jericho, which is slightly in a different spot, but close by. And then we have the modern city of Jericho, which you can actually see some of the houses way up behind the tell. Okay, so that's modern Jericho. Jericho in the Old Testament in ancient times might have looked like this. That is some fortress. Look how many walls it has. It has 2 walls. It is a double-walled city for extra protection. And so look at, it's got a big, what do we call it? A big retaining wall on the bottom. So that's kind of at the bottom. That would have been 12 to 15 feet high. That is way higher than my ceiling. Very tall retaining wall. And then the next layer on top of that was a mud brick wall. It would have been 6 feet thick. Holy cow, that's a thick wall. And it would have been 6 to 8 feet tall. So again, we've got the tall retaining wall and then another tall mud brick. And then there's a second mud brick wall, that upper wall. And that also was about 46 feet off of ground level. This was a big fortress city, and nobody could attack it with their human power. It really needed someone like God to be able to conquer this kind of a fortress. Now, also, when we think of when the Israelites came to conquer Jericho, they didn't have any siege machines. And you might learn about this a little bit later if you learn about machines from medieval times. They didn't have any way to make ramps. They didn't have any way to throw things over, maybe like a trebuchet. We don't think that Israel had any of those tools. And so it really would have been impossible for them to conquer Jericho. Now, Rahab's house would have been on the lower level because the lower level is less protected, and that is where the poor people lived. It may have been a slum. And so it would have been closer to the outside wall. In fact, Rahab's house, it says her house was right up against that outer wall. So the back wall of her house was the city wall. And what that also meant was she would have soldiers walking over her roof because they'd be walking on that outer wall to keep guard. That also plays a factor in our story in just a minute. Now, I have an artist's drawing of Rahab because I wanted us to think about her as a real person, not just a name in the Bible. She was a real human who lived here in Jericho. And tradition says that she was very beautiful, but she was very intelligent, very smart. And I want you to notice, especially if you go read the story with your family, Rahab, it says that she had her own house and that she lived alone. Now, that's a little odd because in ancient times, a young woman would have lived with her parents or with a husband. And when we meet Rahab, she doesn't have either. She's not living with either. And so what that means is that something very bad must have happened in her life that caused her to be on her own. Now, we don't know all of the details, but we do know that she probably had to make some very hard choices in her life and maybe things that she wasn't proud of. And so when we meet Rahab, we're told that she runs an inn, maybe also called a tavern, but it was a place where travelers could come and get a bite to eat and they could stay the night. And so Rahab would have paid attention, I think. She might have paid attention to their conversations and listened for very important information and clues and intel of what was happening outside of Jericho. And maybe, we don't know, but maybe she passed it on to the king. What we do know about Rahab is that she wasn't happy with her life in Jericho. She really was looking for something better. She was looking for someone who truly loved her and could protect her. So when the spies come to Jericho, somehow they end up at Rahab's house, which turned out really well for them because right off the bat, she hid them, right? She had a moment of truth when they got to her house, because remember, the guards came and they said, bring out the spies. And her moment of truth was, well, do I hide the spies and maybe get in really big trouble for something called treason? Or do I turn them in? Maybe she could get a reward in money. I don't know. She had to decide. And so she hid them. And you'll notice I have a picture of flax behind me. Flax is lovely, and it is grown in a field like barley and wheat, like we saw last week with Ruth from Moab. And so flax is actually used for making linen cloth. It's used for clothes. Linen is a very lovely, light, airy fabric, and that's what flax was used for. It was also eaten too, and even today at health food stores you can find flax. You might even find it in your breakfast cereal. Pretty cool. So flax was on her roof drying in the sun, and it would have been in bundles, maybe like this, or it might have been laying flat. And so that was the perfect place to hide the spies. Especially, remember those guards who walked on top of the walls. That way they wouldn't be seen by those guards too. If you think about it, why did she choose to betray her people and hide these spies, these foreign spies? Why would she do that? Well, the next verse gives us a very big clue. So you can read this with me. And it says, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, the people of Jericho, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. Wow, which actually that was the intel that the spies needed to know. They needed to know if people in Jericho were afraid of them. But what that tells us is that Rahab and the people of Jericho are afraid because they've already heard the stories. They already heard about the story of Moses leading the people out of Egypt and God parting the Red Sea. They knew that story. They'd heard it. And they also knew that when the Israelite people were coming toward Jericho, that they defeated two really powerful Canaanite kings. And who can do that? That's amazing. Their God was so powerful. And so the people of Jericho were really frightened because Jericho was next. And Rahab knew this, and she told the spies. And if you read the very next verse underneath it, it says, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. So that's why Rahab hid the spies. She heard those stories. She believed that the God of Israel was the one true God, the God in heaven above and on earth below. And it seems as though maybe she's the only one in Jericho who truly believes and wants to follow this God. So let's see what happens next. She has hidden the spies, she's given them a place to stay, and now she's about to help them escape. And so remember, the soldiers, the guards who came to her house said, bring out the spies, where are they? And she says, they went that way. Did they really go? No, they went that way. She helped them go the opposite direction and into the Judean wilderness where they hid for 3 days. She saved their lives so that they could go back to the Israelite camp and tell Joshua what they had learned. She didn't have to do any of that, but we know she did it because she believed in the one true God. And actually, let's read the next verse. It says at the end of the story, we know that Rahab lives, but listen to this. But Joshua spared Rahab with her family and all who belonged to her because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. Wow, That is amazing that because of what she did, she now gets to have a different life with the Israelites. Now, I almost forgot. I have a quiz for you. I have a pop quiz, a poll, because I forgot to ask you, what was the signal when Joshua and the Israelites came back to conquer Jericho? How did they know which house Rahab and her family were in? How did they know how to save them? So I have this poll. I want you to select one option. Which thing did Rahab send out her window to signal to Israel that was her house? Okay, half of you have voted. I'll give you another 15 seconds. Ooh, she put something out the window. What was it? Was it a white flag out the window? Was it a flower pot on the windowsill? Maybe it was a red cord out the window. Or was it a freshly baked pie on a windowsill? That sounds delicious. Okay, we're going to end voting now. I think most people have voted. Okay, Mr. Ryan is going to end our poll. Okay, survey says a red cord out the window. You guys are correct. Yes, so Rahab was instructed by the spies to hang the red cord out her window so they knew which house she was in and they could rescue her and her whole family. So if you think about it, that red cord is a lot like the blood on the doorposts at Passover, where the death passed over the house and spared the people inside. That's kind of like what this red cord was for Rahab, because her whole family was saved by Joshua and the Israelites. How amazing. And so now Rahab gets to have a new home with the Israelites where she can experience the true love of God and the protection that God gives his people. Wow. So Rahab gets to have a new life. And I want to show you what happened to the rest of Jericho. Here, I'm going to close my poll here. Okay, so here's what happened to Jericho. Ouch. Not much left. And this is what archaeologists, remember scientists who study old things, this is what they have dug on Tel Jericho, on this big mound. And this is a dwelling place. This is like a house. Somebody lived there. And they have also dug down the different levels, and they have discovered at one particular layer that there is evidence of a fire. And we read that in the story too. So it backs up the Bible account of the defeat of Jericho. And it shows a layer of fire, things that were burned, and it also shows jars of grain. And what that also shows is that the Israelites didn't plunder, or they didn't steal things from Jericho to keep for themselves, because everything was still there. So that's really neat how archaeologists have dug in Jericho and found all of these clues that match with the Bible story. One more verse, because this is truly amazing. I'll read this to you. You can listen if you'd like. So you see that a person is considered right with God by what they do. It doesn't happen only because they believe. Didn't God consider even Rahab to be right with him? That's because of what she did for the spies. She gave them a place to stay. Then she sent them off in a different direction. Now, this was written by the brother of Jesus named James. Remember, James has a whole book in the Bible at the end of the New Testament. He wrote this about Rahab. And I want you to think about the action that Rahab took. She didn't have to help the spies at all. She could have just said, yes, I believe the God of the Israelites, and he is the one true God. But maybe not help. And so she chose to take action and to help. And when we get to the very end of her story, it turns out that not only was she saved from Jericho, but she was brought in to the family of God, to the Israelite people. And she married a man named Salmon and had a son. You're gonna love this. The son's name is Boaz. What? We talked about him last week in our lesson on Ruth, because Ruth married Boaz. So what that means is Rahab didn't just join the Israelite family, she helped continue it. And her son, Boaz, remember, he had Obed, who had Jesse, who had David, who became King David. And so Rahab was King David's great-great-grandmother. How special is that for her? And later on, Jesus was in her line. She got to become part of the family of our Messiah, Jesus. Wow. And if we look at the Hall of Fame, the Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews chapter 11, there's only 2 women mentioned there. One is Sarah, the wife of Abraham, and the other is Rahab. So even James praised her faith and her actions to help the people of Israel. And so hiding spies may seem like a really small thing, but it was huge. It had a huge impact because it helped the Israelites to go into the promised land, just like God had promised. And like Ruth from Moab, Rahab from Jericho was an outsider who was adopted into God's family and became the mother of kings and prophets and the Messiah, Jesus. And so just like them, you can show your faith in God by helping others. And I'm sure that you can think of lots of ways to help other people. Like maybe there's a new friend at school, or maybe someone's being bullied on the playground, or maybe you see someone who has a disability and could use some help. You taking action and helping others shows them your faith, and that leads people to God. And so I want you to think about that and find something this week that you can help others. Find a way to take action this week and show your faith by doing. All right, so next week, we're going to talk about one final woman in the line of Jesus, and I know you all have heard about her. Her name is Mary. She's, of course, the mother of Jesus, and we're going to talk about Mary from Nazareth next week. And there's a lot to see in Nazareth, so I hope you'll join me, but that's all we have for today. I'm so glad you guys came and learned about Rahab from Jericho. I'll see you guys next week. Bye, guys.
Bye. 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 Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys. Bye.